because you all have access to the bios, you've had a chance to learn a bit about who Kenichi Serino is. And I just wanted to give you a brief overview of our connection. I met him when we were both working at Global Press Journal. It is a news organization that edits and works with women reporters around the world. So we bonded over two things. First of all, Kenichi sometimes can be the annoying little brother that I never had. Perfect example, this morning I called at 10:10 and said, Kenichi, are you on your way? He said, that's today? And I was like, man, I'm about to reach through this phone and slap him. But another thing we bonded over was being laid off in 2020 because of coronavirus. And so for us both to be standing here right now, employed, happy.
No, but listen, you all know that this industry isn't for like the faint of heart.
Yes.
So I'm sure everyone here has
Absolutely.
gone through their own stuff.
But what I wanted Kenichi to talk about, and we were able to discuss this last week a bit, is the ability to capture and convey important story themes and ideas in the digital format. Sometimes it has to be very fast-paced, short amount of space and time to do it in. And he's a master of that. Listening to him edit and support journalists around the world was just a lesson for me in how to support journalists. So take it away, Kenichi.
Thank you so much. Cool. Hello, everyone. I assume you read the bio. I'm not going to talk about myself a lot. But I am going to start off with a poll because I want to know a little bit about all of you. How many of you right now consider yourselves digital journalists or are digital journalists? Okay, everyone. Who doesn't? It's fine if you're not. Who doesn't? Who doesn't consider themselves, isn't doing digital journalism or, okay, what's your name? I work at NPR. NPR, so a broadcast. And also, are you also broadcast? Okay, that's kind of what I figured. I figured everyone here would be doing digital except for the people who are strictly broadcast. Because that's kind of the world, right? That's just how it is. So I don't think you all need a huge description of what digital journalism is because you're already doing it. You are young enough that you probably grew up in it, unlike myself and maybe Rachel. For me, I started my career in South Africa. And so they were on the kind of cusp of changing, going from all newspapers to kind of a lot more digital. So I'm not going to tell you, this is what digital is, this is what it is, because you already know, and maybe you probably know better than me. But oh, I can't read my own notes, guys. But this is what I'll say is, I started at a student newspaper, like maybe some of you did. And for me, student newspapers are community journalism, so I often call myself having started off as a community journalist. And then I went into newswires, where I learned to write very, very, very fast and a lot. And then I freelanced. And I think for you, maybe knowing what I kind of struggled with when I was in newswires might be kind of applicable to you all. Because in South Africa, there's a funny thing that happens where the country went through a democratic transition in '94. It's a majority black, majority African country, but where you had minority white rule, right? So even though government changed, and even though a lot of the culture changed, and even a lot of the newsrooms changed, and a lot of the newsroom leadership changed, a lot of the normative audiences didn't change. So when your editor says, imagine the audience, like a normal audience, what do they mean? They kind of mean a white audience that is affluent enough to buy a car every 3 years and maybe owns a house or rents in this apartment. And this is especially true in commercial media, where well-off audiences are very desirable. And it's also true in public media for no good reason at all, but except that they default to an imagined educated audience, which is kind of typically white. So for me, even though I was in a newsroom that was majority black, and I was working in a country that was majority black, we still kind of ran into this problem of who we were writing for was this imagined blank slate was still very much this white audience, right? So for me, I kind of banged my head against all this stuff and had some fights with copy editors and won some, lost some. won some, then found out that I lost some. And I think maybe some of you have already had these experiences as well. Win some more, win some more. Now, I'm talking really fast, and that's something I do all the time. If I'm talking too fast, someone needs to raise their hand and say, slow down. You want to raise your, do be the one? You, that's your job? Because you're really like, I can see you're nodding your head a lot, and you seem like you're ready for this. Okay, raise your hand, and that'll be, slow down. So there's not gonna be any PowerPoint. It's all notes that I did in the bus on the way here. No problem. This is probably why I can't read my writing also. So, but just, imagine there's like graphics. You'll have great imaginations, I'm sure. Just kind of go with it. So now, I'm at the present, I'm a digital news editor. My job is a combination of, as some of you know, posting kind of wire copy and doing our own quick turn news stories off of those daily news stories that we want to do. Now, let me back up. So I started freelancing in South Africa. Now, when I started freelancing, I had all these ideas about what I wanted to do. Most of the stuff I'd already done was about inequality. And in South Africa, like in this country, it's highly racialized inequality. Not exclusively, but highly. And I want to do those stories, and I'm very interested in trade unions because I covered a lot of trade unions and politics. I covered a lot of housing, and I covered some education. And so I'm pitching to Western news outlets, in particular at that time, the Christian Science Monitor, which a lot of you probably won't know because none of you are like over the age of 50, that I know of, except for Rachel. I want to say, but I'm like, right. So, but no, but you're an old soul. So it's a great publication. And they were willing to do a lot of foreign stories. But the thing is, convincing them that this was interesting, that something was important to cover was very hard because they'll say, well, you can all tell me about things that your editors have said to you, like, well, is this really news, and who does this affect, and like, how many people does this affect, and this kind of thing, and like, is this really like a story? Is this something that happens all the time? And then what happened was, in 2013, in February, Valentine's Day, a Paralympian named Oscar Pistorius went and shot his girlfriend through a bathroom door. I covered like almost none of the actual trial. I covered like one day of the trial, I was working for Newswire, and like I picked up a shift on that. But I did a ton of stories that were news hooked to Pistorius shooting his girlfriend. So suddenly I could do all these stories I wanted. I just had to figure a way to put like kind of Pistorius into like the third paragraph. So did I want to do a story about like housing and white housing? Absolutely, because why? Pistorius lived in an almost all-white gated community outside of Pretoria. Very, very, very normal. Like if anything, his gated community was less white than a lot of the others in that area. Did I want to do it about white South African men and gun culture? Yeah. Why? Because Pistorius was a gun nut. He was he was crazy about guns. What else did I do? I did stuff about inequity in media. I did stuff about like kind of how mainstream conversations didn't really affect kind of like the black majority. Why? Because this is a white Paralympian who shot his blonde model girlfriend, and the whole world went completely apeshit over it, and really didn't like affect people. And by people I mean the majority of people in South Africa. So I was able to do all these stories that I really wanted to by finding this kind of news peg. And from that, I just learned that actually, I don't need to like bash my head in trying to convince an editor that something's important. I can just use all this energy I have to kind of like shoop and hitch myself to something that's already happening and kind of get into that way. So that's part one. If you can't convince your editor whose job it is to listen to you at least a little bit. But I will say that the question was, is there a risk of making a kind of Frankenstein monster out of a story where you're just trying to cram something that doesn't quite fit onto a news hook? And it's always a danger. But the job is to figure that out, right? And if you can sometimes it doesn't work. Like, you can't do everything. But if you can make those connections, then you're good. And if you can convince it to your editor, whose job it is to listen to you, at least a little bit, then you must convince an audience or a reader of that or a listener of that in the same way, right? So basically, once you see the way to do it, you sort of write it. So for me, writing good nut graphs was very key. Does everyone here know what a nut graph is? Yeah, everyone does. If you don't, that's okay. You just kind of raise your hand very subtly, and I'll okay. So being able to write that good nut graph in 30 words was really key to success here, because once you kind of had that down, you could explain it to your editor and then your editor's editor, because that many times they kind of understand it, but they don't really understand it. They want you to explain it to somebody else who has to give a green light. And you're just going to get very good at this. And I swear, it may seem hard, and you're at hostile faces, but I'm not the smartest person. And so if I can do it, you can absolutely do it. And can I tell you something, working in South Africa and working in foreign countries, and I think Rachel can confirm also, some of these people who are working in journalism, they're such dummies. They're not especially, they're not I don't know, bagging too much, but they're not geniuses. And if they can do it, I promise you, you can all do it. So please do not think that this is beyond your reach. It is absolutely within your reach. Because I've seen the people who do it, and if you got yourselves dressed today, got here, then you can absolutely do it. So, all right, question.
So you were able to do all of these stories attached to Pistorius, but how long did it take you to do those stories? Was this a quick turn daily thing, or did it take a little longer depending on what it was? And I have another question after that, but that's the first one.
No problem. So some of them were quick turn. When I was working for a newswire, some of them would be a quick turn because you're just going so fast. When I was doing Reuters, it was quick turn, you're just doing it in a couple days. Again, everything's very, very fast there. Sometimes some of the bigger pieces I did for The Atlantic, and others were longer. And the thing is, I'm gonna tell you about one story I did for Al Jazeera America was about rhino poaching. There had been a million stories about rhinos, and if you know anything about, if any of you have read Binyavanga Wainainai's How to Write About Africa? Binyavanga Wainainai. He was a Kenyan writer who wrote it. Rachel, have you read it? Yeah, it's amazing. Say what? How to Write About Africa. It's very available on the internet, and I'm sure Rachel can, she probably has it in a bookmark.
I can send you all a link to it.
And I won't go with the whole thing, but in it, he makes this joke about how humans are dehumanized, but animals are anthropomorphized. So lions always shake their heads very proudly, and humans kind of grovel and all these kinds of things. So, and he also has this joke about how people are white and the people are black. It's an amazing piece. But for me, what this comes back to with the rhinos is rhino poaching rhinos have been treated as people. It's very sad what happens in rhino poaching. It's a brutal trade. But always the poachers and the people involved were treated as these shadowy figures who never had names and were just kind of these blank slates, right? So with Al Jazeera, we did a story that was about the rhino poachers and the rangers. And that took they pitched me on it. They asked me to do something around rhinos at one point. I spent about 3 months doing the research for it. So I'm doing lots of other things. I'm working a couple hours a week on this doing research, knowing when I had a due date. And then, in the last month, I went in earnest and spent maybe half my time working on it, doing the phone calls, setting things up. And then I did 2 weeks of intense, just out in the field, and then I wrote it in 2 days. So that's an example of something that took a very long time. Similarly, I did a story for Al Jazeera America, which kind of comes back into this about, I had wanted to do a story about student protests, a student protest movement called Fees Must Fall in 2013. And because I couldn't get anyone to bite for reasons that were just dumb, I just had it in my head for an entire year. And then Atlantic kind of swept through and said, do you want to do, they asked me to do a story on something that was very kind of dumb, and I said, that's dumb, and what about this? And they said, that sounds great, and we did it. And so for that story, in a way I had been thinking about for a year. And I'm sure you all know that the work you do in a story isn't the work that you do from pitch to end. The work is all of this other stuff you're doing around thinking about a subject, digesting a subject, reading about the other subject until you kind of exist in the world. And so that was a year. And then I pulled that story, I did the interviews and everything in about 2 weeks. and this is like the really terrible part. I got paid I'll say it, like I got paid by the Atlantic the very grand sum of $280 for that piece. So, and that's life. So, and the thing is, I had been wanting to do that for a year. I'm sure for some of you, the worst thing in the world isn't to write something and not be like compensated enough for it. For me, the worst thing is to conceive a good idea and have it die inside of you. And so for me, like, I was very happy just to have this live in the world. And it was also a story that I could hang my head on. That story got sent to a lot of editors when like job hunting happened. So where this is going with regards to digital is that, okay, let me stop. Questions? Yeah.
So some of us work in a company that shall not be named who focuses so much on metrics that like some of our stories get questioned on, is this actually worth it to do by the editors? Because they're thinking about, well, what about the page views? What about the subscriptions and all that stuff? How do we sell it to editors who are so gung-ho on metrics to where it now goes into the metrics of a story favors white, cis, heteronormative males?
Sure.
Like, how do we get past that noise of, this is not going to get us many page views, this is not going to get us many subscriptions? Like, how do we sell those stories to our editors, even though, like, that's their main goal?
Yeah, no, it's a tough beat. Do you mind if I come to that later? Because that's my next section, actually, so you're preempting me. Anyone else? Okay, so this is what this is Mr. Digital. So I don't have a really good answer for that because, you know, we all like, I mean, sometimes when I'm working with people, I say, you know, I'm a deputy editor, I've got an editor, I've got a managing editor, and then I got an editor named SEO. And actually, SEO is the one who decides all my headlines, no matter what I want, because that's just how it goes, right? And no one ever appointed Google at PBS, but somehow it calls a lot of shots, and that is just kind of like the reality we live in, right? Now that said, this is where digital can be emancipatory. There's a lot of stuff, as some of you may know, in journalism that's left over from back when we did text. So you guys have all heard the story about inverted pyramid and the lead, knocking out the lead in the bottom of the page? No. Oh, wow. I get to tell you to you. So this is because I'm showing my age, but back in the day, newspapers printed their entire newspaper page on hot lead. It was like formed up, and then it came through a press, and they pressed it into the paper as it like kind of spun around. And one of the reasons you did inverted pyramid was so that the guys in the print room could take a chisel and knock off the bottom of the story if it was over the edge of the paper. So inverted pyramid was a way of organizing stories so that you could break off like parts of it in the print room, and they're not editors, and they didn't need to read it. They just like knocked it off, right? So that's one of the reasons why we still we teach inverted pyramid is just because of like this very. I mean, how many here have like used hot lead in their newsrooms? It's not a lot, right? Okay, but we still do it. And there's other reasons we do inverted pyramid. Inverted pyramid can be a very good way of organizing thoughts and organizing ideas in a story. And it's also very fast if you're looking for speed, which sometimes you are. What else? There's a guy with the whole TED Talk about this. Like y'all have used a digital camera before, right? And you know cameras are shaped with the lens here, and then there's a big chamber here, the body's here, and you kind of click, click, click. Why is the camera shaped that way? I mean, it's shaped that way because we used to use film, right? We used to have to actually use film that had to be behind a mirror, and then it made the impression. We don't do that anymore. Like, if anything, like our cameras could look like giraffes if you wanted to. Same thing with QWERTY keyboards, right? You guys know what a QWERTY keyboard is? You all do, because you've all used one today. Yeah, that's a regular keyboard. Sorry, it wasn't. I swear it wasn't meant to be. But the reason a QWERTY keyboard is shaped that way is because back when typewriters were built, you actually had to slow down the typists, because when the keys would kind of spring up like this, if they went too fast, they'd bind up on the page. So you needed a keyboard that would actually slow down the keyboardist so that you wouldn't get them crossing each other. So the QWERTY keyboard is actually designed to be slow. You could all be typing much faster with a keyboard called Dvorak, which I used briefly when I was a teenager and then gave up because it was like it's hard to be that different. But it's but yeah, you can. I mean, so basically, your keyboard on a computer is designed to be slow for no reason other than something that happened 30 years ago. So, and newsrooms kind of operate in the same way. Like everyone's been in digital now for like years, and it's been so long. None of you even know about the whole inverted pyramid and the lead thing, right? Like that means like even that the old guys in your newsroom aren't even telling the story. I had old guys in my newsroom who told me the story all the time. So what that means is we have like these kind of some ideas around audience are very, very tied to that old idea around audience, around who's reading, and this idea of scarcity in newspapers. Because you just didn't have enough space to get everything in. And in addition to which, a story that might be alienating to your audience wouldn't run because we're just gonna get a lot of letters about this. Today, I'm not saying it's really different, but today it's a little bit different in that a story can run on a website and its audience isn't confined to that locality. It's not confined to like that journal audience. I work in PBS Digital now, and I can tell you, like, you know, the things that people do for PBS Newshour broadcast. Newshour broadcast is, for me, an amazing American institution. I watch it, I like it. They do, I could go on forever about the quality of the work they do. But they still have to keep in mind an audience that I don't. And like for those of you who work in kind of national TV, you will know that the audience for national television is a lot older and is a lot whiter and is a lot more wealthy than the general population of America. And so you're always that is always in the back of your mind when they're working, right? For me, I don't need to worry about that. And for me, I can do a story and I don't need to worry about it alienating that audience necessarily. I can know that it's going to find another audience elsewhere. And one of the reasons I wanted to work in public media is that in public media, you know, it's everyone I'm sure people who work in public media know that it's very, very far from perfect and especially about how they imagine audiences. But I don't know, it is much easier to say, listen, this is important because the word public media is in our name, and therefore we should do this. There's a strong reason to do this. And for me, I'm lucky enough that in my job, I have editors, both in the broadcast side and the digital side, who accept that. I told them when I was interviewing for this job, this is how kind of I envisioned it, and they were really, really cool with that. So digital in that way can be very emancipatory in that you are not bound by kind of what the normal audience is for your publication is, because we know who that normative audience is. Now for you, the metrics, it's really hard. If you have an editor who's hyper-focused on metrics, it's extremely difficult. I don't have a very good answer. You're gonna hate the answer I'm about to give you. But there was a reason I had that Atlantic story in my notes. It's because it is something that I wanted to do. There was no financial reason to do it whatsoever. I wouldn't have done it for free, but the amount of labor that went into it was completely incomparable to what I was paid. And sometimes you may find yourself just doing stuff that you're interested in that they will not give you your time for. And that answer sucks. And it creates an extra tax on everyone in this room who isn't like white, and like as you say, cis normative and all these things. But it is, in the same way sometimes that they say you gotta dress the job you want, you gotta write the stories sometimes for the next job that you want also. And I'm really sorry that's the case. Like, if I could make it different, I would. You can do a couple things. So this is what I did. I did it when I was working in wires. So the question was, do you recommend going outside of a newsroom, your own newsroom, to do these stories? I did a couple things. When I was working for a wire in South Africa, There was a story around Zimbabwean migrancy that I really wanted to do. I won't go into the whole details because it'll be like it'll be very boring to you. But there's a lot of xenophobic attitudes around Zimbabweans, and this story kind of unpacked the actual numbers and what that means. And I got eye rolls when I pitched it, right? And I just did it. I did it like on my day off. Like at Newswires, you work in shifts. So when I had weekend shifts, I had 2 days during the week that I was meant to be off. I'd come in, I'd do I wouldn't work until midnight, but you do a few hours, and then I didn't. In the end, I didn't even finish it on my own time. In the end, I kind of went back to the news editor and said, hey, listen, I've been working against my own time. I'm almost done. And he was like, oh, that's great, just finish it. So sometimes that happens. I've also taken I've also pitched things outside of the places where I worked because I was most of the time I was on contract, and that I was allowed to. Again, some of you may not have that option. It's very personal about what you can your employer will allow you to do. I've also been in situations where I pitched stories. I was on contract to Reuters, and they'd asked me just person to person give us the first taste of whatever you're going to do, and I pitched them something, and they're like, oh, I don't know about that. And I was like, oh, and for me, I was like, okay, because Reuters pays. I'm not going to but we don't need to go into the deals. But I was okay with taking it elsewhere. And the news editor had turned it down. He was walking out for the night, and then halfway down the hallway, he turns around and says, actually, why don't you do it? Because in that walk halfway down the hallway, he knew I was going to take it elsewhere because I'd said, okay, way too fast. And and in his head, he's thinking about that call he's going to get from London saying, hey, why don't you have the story? And then what kind of answers he's going to give to his boss over there. So people will say no to things, but they also get I'm sure some of you know already, they get very, very funny at the idea that someone else is going to have it. Where was I? So the other thing about this isn't necessarily unique to digital, but okay, so how many of you were working in 2020 during George Floyd protests? Black Lives Matter, okay. Almost everyone, right? No problem. Now, how many of you, there were lots of protests and lots of news stories around police brutality, in particular amongst black men, right? I don't know the numbers here, but would any of us be shocked if the number of black men shot by police wasn't higher in 2020 than it was in 2019 or 2018? I mean, the actual statistics, the actual severity of the issue, right? It would. It's continually a problem. But people got very excited about it in 2020 because of the video footage of George Floyd and then the subsequent footage and protests. And that kind of goes to another way you can. I don't want to say this is for executive session, but I'll say anyways. There is such a thing as, you all know about FOMO, right? There is such a thing that I would call white FOMO, where an issue can live amongst the community for a very, very long time, and that issue is completely irrelevant to the broader, what we call in academia, the public sphere, which often reads in America affluent, white, wealthy. Yeah, I'll leave it there. But what happens is, for those people to speak to each other knowledgeably, they have to suddenly know about this issue that's been affecting a marginalized community for a very long time. And that feeling is a very powerful feeling, and it can be something that can motivate news stories. So, I know from anecdotally from other Asian American journalists that they had tried to pitch stories about Chinese New Year or Filipino New Year or any of these events that were very important in their communities that might have large local populations, and got nowhere until Stop AAPI Hate happened. Because suddenly now you have to know about these issues to show other people like yourself that I am a knowledgeable person who's up on issues and is very concerned about these things and is current, because God help you if you aren't current. That's why we all, you see all those people carry around their copies of White Fragility very ostentatiously. So, yeah, so I think when you're trying to think of conceive stories and pitch them, You don't pitch it to your editor the way I just told you, but do you kind of come to them with this by saying that this isn't important to my community because if you say it's important to my community, you're going to get the like, well, are you going to be? Is this biased? Is this like does? Is this? I mean, what's this going to be? Is this an opinion piece? But you have to kind of come at it and say this is important to like our audience for these reasons. And for me, that's just been like kind of the source of success.
Hi, I'm Sabrina. I work at a broadcast station, commercial broadcast station in Sacramento, California, and we have a race and culture unit that I work with. And I guess I'm just curious because, like, I come from a community, Stockton, that's really diverse, but it's like known as like being quote unquote ghetto, like all that stuff. And so I pitch a lot of stories about my community because that's where I come from. It's all types of communities, but I noticed that like I become the I guess person like tokenized, what stories, and I guess how do you balance that when you're like really trying to advocate for these stories in your community that gets only coverage about crime, mugshots, and all that. I think that's the hardest thing is like, I don't know, that like balance of, I'm not the expert either, like I'm just like trying to do good, but I don't know.
No, I think I got you. There's a couple of questions, like a couple of ideas in there to unpack. Because I think maybe like for me, I've worked mostly overseas, so I never got slotted into like a group wherever I was. Except maybe, I got interested in like the Zimbabweans because it dealt with migratory and immigration. And immigration was something I was always like, because immigration affected me a lot. It was something I was always interested in. Like, guys, I was an illegal immigrant like twice. Like my passport disappeared for 10 months. It was kind of crazy. I got stories about like kind of like, the nice thing about police in South Africa, I don't want to talk about the story, but the nice thing about police asking for gifts is that you can kind of get them over a barrel before they ask you for your papers. Just my personal experience. So, but to answer your question, I think a lot of us, a lot of y'all in this room have had this experience of feeling like you're the one who's going to be asked to cover a certain thing all the time, right? And they won't say why, but you know why. But at the same time, you may be like very pissed off if Brian and Chad cover that issue because maybe they do it very badly. So you're in this total bind where like you don't want to be the one who has to like do these stories all the time, but you also don't want to see someone else like mess it up. I was gonna say something else, but you got the idea. So again, I don't have a good answer, but I think as you all know that covering that community, in a lot of newsrooms, there's a ceiling to it. Like you're not going to become like you're not going to enter management through that kind of way, maybe necessarily. I mean, like it could have change in the future, but like if you look at the other people around who kind of climbed, they didn't do it that way. So again, it's highly individual. It's kind of up to you. In terms of what you want to do, like I would just say be selective. Not every story that comes out of your community that your news editor, I'm sure you have gotten this, like your news editor has asked you to do a story from your community and it's like hot garbage. Like it's the dumbest thing you've ever seen. Just say, no, I can do that one. And and leave it. And do something that's going to be more important. So, is he not named Chad at your newsroom? Okay. All right, sorry. So, no, apologies to any Chads. Yeah. So I think, you just have to be, I would say, be judicious about what you're going to do. Sometimes maybe, instead of sometimes thinking of it as a burden, which it sometimes is, also sometimes think of it as your unfair advantage. The thing that you can do that those others can't. And you can use that advantage grinding out those dumb stories that your news editors like asking you to do, or you can take that advantage and kind of do more interesting things. So for example, do you guys know what Cape Town is, the city? In South Africa. It's a beautiful city. It's like one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Has an insane gang violence problem. Joburg gets all the bad rap, but Cape Town actually has a much higher murder rate than Joburg does. Because Joburg's affects the middle classes, whereas Cape Town's is mostly gang murders, which means that people don't care as much. Mainstream media doesn't care as much. So a reporter at a newspaper called the Mail and Guardian, she did a story on metric dances. You guys know what prom is? You all know what prom is. But metric dances are like the equivalent of prom there. And this story was just a very kind of human interest story about girls and boys preparing for metric dances in this neighborhood that had enormous gang violence. And it wasn't a perseverance story. Like, it didn't kind of fetishize the gun violence or anything like that. Instead, it just showed that there are human beings living here. And they're living their lives. And yeah, there's stuff like happening outside. And yes, so this person who you're interviewing lost a family member recently. But it was very, very much about how they just carry on living their lives, and it was amazing. A few years ago, I saw a similar story in Detroit, in a community that wasn't as bad off as this township in Cape Town, but still had gotten a very bad rap in the city. It got a bad rap because it suffered a lot of gun violence. But the story was just about people having prom. And it filled multiple functions. For me, reading it, it allowed those people to be seen, like really seen, and especially kids, like teenagers, on is probably one of the best days of their young lives, right? Prom or matric dance. And the time when they get to feel really grown up because they're doing the makeup and they're putting on the tuxedos and all those things. And it also, it allowed them to feel seen, and it also allowed the broader kind of readership. And that public history readership is probably more educated than most. They would never have understood this township in that way. That it was a place where people live, live. That there, I don't know if this makes sense to you, just that there are people alive here. You know?
Kenichi, I know that you got to head back because you're on at noon. Kenichi was originally going to be joining us by Zoom, but his schedule changed. But part of the reason he was joining us by Zoom is because he's covering the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearings, and he has to sort of coordinate that. So before you leave us, I want you to tell the fellows about the story you told me about,
sure.
that you pitched,
Okay.
and were able to get over the...
So Ketanji Brown Jackson is very interesting because, with her, okay, let me back up. So when you're I don't know, who here is freelanced? Okay, so when you're freelancing, you're never doing day of stories because no one needs the day of stories. They already got their own reporters on it, and you're always thinking creatively about things you can do that are going to be missed. With Jackson, I had understood the fact that she was historical as the first Black woman nominee was very important, but was also very heavily covered. And what was undercovered was the fact that she was also the first former public defender on the Supreme Court, or will be. And it's major. There are 3 prosecutors on the Supreme Court right now. There's nobody with a criminal defense background. The last criminal defense lawyer on the Supreme Court was Thurgood Marshall, who left 27 years ago and was nominated 55 years ago. Think on that. Before some of your parents were born is the last time there was a criminal defense lawyer on the Supreme Court. It's nuts. As someone else pointed out on social media, that there are more judges who worked Bush v. Gore in Florida than there are public defenders at the Supreme Court. Yeah. Was that you? Yeah. Amy Coney Barrett, John Roberts, and Kavanaugh. So it's completely the proportions are crazy. And so for me, that, it's very, for me, it can, one way to look at it is to say, well, people are too hyper-focused on her race or gender. But for me, this was actually a different kind of racial equity issue because we understand how the criminal justice system affects mostly Black and brown communities in this country, right? So for me, there was a very superficial equity story around her being It's important. I don't want to say it's not superficial or not important. I need to choose words carefully. It's very important that she's the first Black woman nominee. But there was a even bigger, in my opinion, thing under the surface where the way she's spent her career as a public defender, as a criminal defense lawyer, and as a member of the Sentencing Commission, that could really change the way dissents are written in the court. Because as you all know, when she was nominated for me, in my head I was thinking, like, the good news is a Black woman is finally going to be given like this due and sit on the Supreme Court. And the bad news is she's going to be writing 6-3 dissents for like 40 years. But those, as some of you know, those dissents are very important. And their discussions aren't transparent. But having her in part of the discussions, as they do, is very important because she, as you all know, as some of you know, discussions can happen. Discussions in your newsrooms can go one way when everyone in the newsroom is white. And just by being there sometimes, having your face there, you don't even say a word. But people will not say certain things, and they will be reminded that they must take certain other things into account before they move forward with the story. Okay, any questions?
Hello, my name is Brian Lopez. I'm with the Texas Tribune. So, like you mentioned, a lot of us probably work in fast-paced environments. You go from one thing to the next, and you're trying to juggle different kind of things. How do you kind of how would you take the time to kind of step back and, look at the nut graph from the big breaking news story and try to thread it out into, this, connects to this and this connects to that, and pitching that to your editors who want you to, do the next big thing coming up?
It's tough, especially when you're on the treadmill like that. And so if you're on the general news beat, it's very hard because they're always wanting you to do something else. If you're on a beat, it's a little more easier. But for me, let me think. So with with Jackson, for example, I pitched Jackson a month ago. I got busy with other stuff, did something else, came back to it, and it was just something that I had pitched them, and I did some of it on company time. I did my usual day things, and I just took an hour here, an hour there. And then to write it, I don't know about you all, but I can't write when the Slack's pinging. It drives me nuts. So I did it on the weekend, and then I did one big push from 5 o'clock until 4 a.m. the night before, and just got it done. And we won't talk about how the next day was, but or how many things had to be corrected, but that's just how I did it. Because for me, working, doing it at 4 a.m. Was a much better alternative to feeling it die inside you. I wanted to see it out there. So again, for you, really hard, but I think, I don't know what kind of newsroom support you're given, what kind of career advancement you're given, but I think in this moment, a lot of newsrooms at least are paying lip service to professional development. And so you can go in that to say, listen, I'm doing my work. It's always very helpful if you've had good, what is the word, performance reviews in the past. To say listen, I've been doing my job. I don't want to keep doing this forever, and I have these more grander ideas. And can I carve out a little bit of time here to do them? And can I do some of my own time? I've also done things where when I was on dailies, I had you to come up with stuff every day. I pitched stuff for the day, and then I had a secret diary that I kept all of my 1-month stories, and another secret diary where I had all of my 6-month stories. And so as I was doing daily stories, I was thinking what about this? I'm I want to know more about this, and so I just kind of put it in the list of things to do. And so I just kept multiple diaries of the things that I had to do that day to satisfy a news editor. And then I kept my own diary of things that I'm going to come back to later on. And then I'm going to pitch them after I've kind of gotten a lot of things lined up. Because if you can show them, in my experience, it may not be the same for yours, but in my experience, if you can show them that a lot of the legwork has been done already, it just kind of does this sort of budget in their head where well, I don't need to lose Brian for a whole day to do this since he only needs X number of time. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Heba Ahmed. I work at NPR, so also public media. One of the struggles I think that exists is like we're so radio focused and trying to bridge the gap between radio and adapting the stories, the interviews that we do for digital. What are kind of like some of the tips that you have for producers who really want to get those interviews or whatever the information gathering that we do, the reporting actually, and translate it over to digital, because that's like where the more diverse audience is. And it's also how we get bylines, because on the show we don't get bylines, so it's also an equity issue in the newsroom.
So at PBS we do a lot of the same thing. Like for us, a lot of digital team does a lot of the translation ourselves. So some of the correspondents are more engaged on the digital side than others. But basically, a lot of the heavy lifting is done by digital in terms of like moving things around and like kind of figuring out a way to translate. So by digital, are we thinking just on the website, or are we thinking on socials? Everything. I think just really when you are listening for things, like really think about things that can be turned into content for the site very easily. And for me, I mean, I'll go home today and I'm going to watch the reporting that we do. I'm going to listen to the hearings, and then I'm going to flag clips to pull out. That's what I did all yesterday. I flag clips all day for Instagram. I say this would be good. You get someone to write it. You can do this again for the website. Again, I don't know your rules. You can post to the website. Because I come from a very heavily feature writing background, my answer is almost always, we'll think about what can be done in like a week about something, as just a fresh news story. But I think maybe, I don't know how your newsroom is, but in a lot of newsrooms, the legacy is what's the bread and butter, and the digital is the little moon that flies around it. So sometimes treating it like equals is a mistake, and instead you should be thinking like, well, one side needs to pull from the other more, and that needs to kind of shape it. So your job may be less like being a liaison between two equal parties and more of, I gotta figure out a way to turn this content every day into something else. So can you just storyfy it? Can you just say, well, I got a bunch of interviews. I mean, so if someone's gonna write a piece to the site who's produced the story, how do they feel about turning that into a written piece? At the time, the thing is they got other responsibilities, so time might be an issue, but they can absolutely do it. And if they can't do it, for me, I trained a lot of younger journalists, how many of you are doing things that you never thought you would have done 2 years ago? All you, right? What if I told you that in 2 years you're going to be doing things that now seem impossible, right? I assure you that everyone, as surely as you're doing things now that you didn't know you could do back then, you will do things in the future that you think you can't do now. So if you can't, so for me, especially working with young journalists, if I'm hearing I can't do it, or sometimes it comes from older ones too, if I'm hearing I can't do it, I'll say, what can you do? And if they can't write a finished piece, I'm gonna say man, write me a draft. Write a rough draft and I will fix it. We had this problem at our old newsroom where there was a mommy fix it attitude where reporters would kind of throw stuff at you and then it was like, well, mommy fix it, and you had to fix it. So you don't want that to be a habit, but if you want people just to get going, have them throw the notepad at you. The content they put on the radio can be turned into a news story very easily. When I worked in Newswires, a lot of our job was doing these things called lifts, where you would hear a piece on the radio, and then you would either match or lift. So you'd either take that story and you turn an entire news story out of it. You'd set the original, radio station, but you were just kind of putting it up on the wire. Now you call it aggregating, but this is, I'm old, so this is in the days before that. So, or you do a match where you hear it and then you replicate it yourself. So there's plenty in even a 15-second news broadcast to turn into 300 words on a story. But people just don't think it's, I haven't done this in a long time. It's not hard. It's not hard to do. And if doing the whole thing is too much of a reach, figure out some place in the middle. And if that middle is too much of a reach, as low as you need to go, get them to do something. Because, you know, a lot of times that first push is the hardest. And once they kind of like make the first kind of step and they realize they haven't like fallen flat, then it gets easier, and then you got them.
You can see why I said earlier that sitting next to Kenichi and listening to him support journalists around the world was so instructive to me. His willingness to go the extra mile and talk it through and help journalists really sort of get on track with what they were doing was very impressive. So I've urged you to really reach out to all of our speakers and just take them up on it, but you're going to be busy dealing
Rachel,
with
thank you very much. Please, like, do give me a shout. Like, I have socials and I have my email, and Rachel has all these. I'm happy to share any of my contact info. Happy to share it. No problem.
So let's give Kenichi a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for the nice things to say about me, and thank you for the very nice questions.
Great.